Stanford University.
Welcome to Stanford Open Office Hours. My name is John R. Rickford, and I'm a professor of linguistics here at Stanford. And today I want to talk a little bit about some issues having to do with language and dialect and ethnicity in particular, and respond to a number of questions. I've gotten, many, 15 or 20 questions that relate to this general topic. I just want to say a little bit at the beginning about dialects and how they arise. And in general, dialects arise because of the fact that language is constantly changing. So that when two peoples are separated, two groups of people are separated over time, then the different varieties of the language grow apart. And you can see the clear example of American English and British English separated over a number of centuries by an ocean, and now they sound vastly different. Okay? Similarly, we see different parts of the country where you get separation. So they're regional dialects, and they're also, however, social and ethnic dialects. So anytime you have different groups of people who are not interacting on a regular basis, for one reason or another, different dialects arise. And over the last 50 years, we've spent a lot of time studying social class dialects in New York City and other parts of the country, and also ethnic dialects. And within ethnic dialects within the United States, African American vernacular English, the vernacular English of African Americans, is one of the most distinctive and certainly one of the most studied varieties. Now, the reason this is of immediate interest to me this particular time is because of the testimony of Rachel Jeantel, the star witness for the prosecution in the George Zimmerman case that just concluded in July. Now, Rachel Jeantel was a very important witness for the prosecution because she spent a lot of time on the phone with Trayvon Martin the night he was died. She was talking to him up till about 2 or 3 minutes before he actually was shot. So she had a lot of crucial details. But there were several aspects of her testimony that to some extent may have made it hard for the jurors to understand. She did tend to speak a little softly sometimes. She did have a lot of attitude towards Don West, the defense attorney. But I think most of all was the fact that she was a classic speaker of African American vernacular English. I could give you many examples of ways in which she showed that, but one was the fact that she used the stress been. It was when she said, I was been paying attention, which means I'm paying attention now, and I have been paying attention for a long time. And we've done some studies with this that in fact shows that very often when you ask black and white listeners what been means in sentences like, she been married, very often white speakers will say she isn't married now. And they don't get the sense that African American speakers almost get immediately, she is married now and she's been married for a long time. And there are a lot of other respects in which she shows that she's using this very complex beautiful system, which all languages and dialects have. People often tend to think that if you're not speaking the kind of proper standard mainstream English, you're not following any rules. But every language and every dialect around the world, whether you like it or not, is systematic and complex, and linguists spend years trying to understand it. In the case of Rachel Jeantel, very often she deletes is and are, so that she would say he happy, they at the store, and so on. But she follows a system that we find in the Caribbean and in many other parts of especially the kind of black diaspora world, in which you can delete the is and are very often before an adjective, like he happy, but much less often before a noun phrase, like he, the police. You're more likely to say he is the police, or he is a nice person, okay? And she shows that to a T. We can show you immediately. So some of the issues that arose in the trial, I started writing about her. I started writing little commentaries on her as soon as she started appearing around June 25th, 26th. And I said, well, maybe jurors mightn't relate to her, but I think they'll understand her. And I gave a number of reasons for that. Now, as it turns out, we heard from juror B37 later on that she said a lot of the times we couldn't understand her. And then she also said, we didn't find her credible. So this was really a major blow for the prosecution and a major blow for Trayvon Martin, and I think may have had a major effect on the case, even though there were lots of other witnesses, because her testimony was so important that for it to be disregarded and for them to go away with the impression that she's somehow not credible I think is disastrous. The questions that have come into me about this trial are very interesting. People have asked about, the extent to which language plays a role in how the world perceives you. Maria Gregorio, for instance, asked about that. How you're perceived in terms of personality, ethnicity, social class, and so on, not just in terms of the quality of language as evidence. And it's true, people kind of form perceptions of you in all these respects. But they also form very sharp perceptions of you in terms of how credible you are. Only today, one of my grad students, Annette Donofrio, shared with me a study that, in fact, I hadn't known about before, done by Shiri Lev Ari and Boaz Kesar in Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, that looked at non-native speakers versus native speakers, and in particular non-native speakers who had a light accent or a heavy accent. And it turns out that if they just say they're relaying a message, like for instance, if they say, ants don't sleep, I mean, who knows whether it's true or not. But it turns out that if a native speaker says it, then people tend to think that that's true, a high percentage of the time. But if they have a mild or a heavy accent, then people think it's not true. Okay, these particular writers think this has to do with the ease of processing. So they think a non-native dialect is somehow harder to process. What's interesting in their case is that they went back and they said to people, this is an experiment. We're trying to see how accents affect your credibility. And that had an effect on the difference between native and mildly accented speakers. So the mild accented speakers, they gave them more credibility. But the heavy accented speakers never improved. They continued to believe that somehow what they were saying was not true. And certainly somebody like Rachel Jeantel would be considered a heavy accented speaker from the point of view of the jurors. This is an interesting issue because a number of people, Christine Rafal, Devyani Sharma, Miranda Axworthy, Rebecca Johns, wrote in to ask, how could we change dialect prejudice? We know from many studies that people consider speakers of non-standard or non-prestigious varieties of the language somehow more negatively. Less educated, they think of them as less creative, they think of them as less competent, they tend to think of them as more vulgar. It's really amazing the sets of attributes they give to this. And in some sense, you do have to change it because you cannot, for instance, in a courtroom require that the only witnesses that you will have are people who speak the standard variety. If a deep foreign accented speaker happens to see the murder taking place, that's the person you've got to have understand. And so you have to have ways of getting the jurors and the entire courtroom to overcome their inborn dialect prejudices. First of all, I guess the first thing would be to admit it and to realize that it is a prejudice. One linguist, Wayne O'Neill, said some years ago at the height of the Ebonics Controversy in Oakland that dialect prejudice is one of the last remaining valid prejudices. So, you can't be overtly sexist. You can't be overtly against people of different sexual orientation. You're not supposed to be overtly racist. But we can all agree that certain varieties of English are just bad talk and people should talk better, right? And because of that, people then go on to use that very often as a cover for making all kinds of dreadful pejorative judgments about people. Well, might it help if we somehow just kind of try to expose them to research to show them that these people speak in these accents and yet they're good, loving, bright, intelligent, thoughtful, credible people, It's interesting. Some of the people who've blogged on this are people who are themselves speakers of deep dialects. And they talk about, my father spoke like that, my mother spoke like that. These are the people who, gave me bread, who gave me love. So they don't have that kind of negativity associated with the accent. But I'm not sure if you can just tell people, this dialect prejudice is not really justified. This person is a good person. Believe me. Let me show you some good people who speak like this. And we see even from the experiment that if you sensitize people to the issue, it makes a difference for mild dialect speakers. But heavy dialect speakers, they say, I don't care what. They're just terrible. Okay. Now, it's difficult to know what to do because there's a number of other people point out, Christine Rafal in particular, there's a very strong element of attitude. As we try to figure out how much person A understands person B, it's not just about, are they familiar with the sounds? Are they familiar with the grammatical structures? Are they familiar with the words? But what's their attitude to them? Because we have also a lot of research evidence that if person A is negative to person B, then they tend to just kind of throw up their hands and say, I can't understand them. We get this issue a lot of times with TAs, right? TAs, foreign accented TAs, where people will say, well, I don't understand anything they say. It turns out it's not quite true, okay? And in fact, linguist Roger Shai today sent me some information on a program he did years ago with the Norfolk Public Schools, when he started to work with teachers, white teachers who were working with black kids, and they say, we don't understand anything they say. Just a very interesting point. This is the issue I started to think about through the John Tell trial. There's no question that the African American kids understand standard English, right? So like John Tell, she told the court, I understand English very, very well. But when she comes to speak, she speaks in vernacular English. Now, is the court understanding her? Are teachers understanding her? Are judges understanding you? Are employers understanding you? I don't think we have any sense of how widespread this issue is. Now, how do we get to improve that dialect prejudice? Or how we overcome some of the obstacles? Well, one person, another friend of mine here in Palo Alto said, well, John, what you should do is try to start a petition to require them to have translators for Ebonics or African American English speakers. Well, to begin with, we don't really have the research we need about the extent of misunderstanding and what causes it, whether it's, as I said, in the pronunciation system or the grammatical system, but also because there are very, very powerful attitudes that will work against this, both within the African American community and among the white community and other segments of the community. People would say, well, geez, we all speak English. Why do we need to have translators, okay? Even though it's quite clear that at some points, Rachel Jeantel could have benefited from a translator. So people will often say that, are you suggesting I'm not American? Do you need to have a translator for me? My family has been here how many 100 years, and so on and so forth. So you have to kind of counter those attitudes and you have to work around them. There are many people who even deny the existence of African American English. When we had the Ebonics Controversy in 1996, 97, a lot of people said, it doesn't exist. People used to speak like that in the 19th century, but that's not the case now. The most striking case was someone who told a linguist, said, ain't nobody talking no Ebonics, okay? And of course he was being deadly serious without realizing that he was exemplifying some of the crucial structures. So I think we have to, my immediate answer to that question of how do we improve it, it has to be some kind of education process. But we also have to do a little more research to understand exactly where the difficulties lie and exactly where the attitudes are coming about. And then we have to be very sensitive in the kinds of programs that we suggest for overcoming them. I think having some kind of translation is inevitable. And in some cases, I think the folks down in Jamaica, for instance, my colleague Hubert Devonish and others there working with Jamaican Creole have really gone a lot further than we have in the United States in trying to get people to recognize that Jamaican Creole is quite distinct from Jamaican Standard English, and we have to do something to help people in the courts, in the schools, and in other major public institutions. We have a lovely question from Giovanni Teresi, who says, I'm a poet and a writer. He's in Paris, apparently. And he says, I think that every linguistic expression that describes the real ethical and social values and religious values, I guess, of an individual should be respected. And I would go further than this. I like the question. I like the fact that he's a poet, because I think every language should be respected, every language and every dialect. As I think I said before, every language is so complex and from a certain point of view, in a sense, so beautiful. I don't think the average person realizes or understands how complex language is and how expressive it can be, just as how most of us don't realize, how complex the inner workings of our bodies are. I mean, I guess you become a student of anatomy or medicine, and you come to appreciate how intricate everything is and how it all fits together. Years ago, I wrote a paper called Me, Tarzan, You, Jane. Me, Tarzan, You, Jane. It was about speakers of these varieties, pidgins and creoles, which come about in situations of language contact, and involve mixtures of different languages and sometimes some amount of reduction and simplification. And people often dismiss them as non-standard varieties. And I showed in this paper, several cases in which you had individuals who are telling very powerful stories in that language. People often think that you have to be a speaker of standard English to tell a powerful story. And of course, we see many novelists who show that that's not true. But, there were some very powerful examples I had recorded while doing field work in Guyana. For instance, this one woman who was a weeder on the sugar estates, a very low status, low paying job. And she talked about the fatigue and frustration that the job involved. And she said, sometimes you feel one feelings, they're back down, which means you're at the back of the cane fields. You fall down, you say, God, he better you're dead. How hard you work, how you got to punish. He better be dead. So in other words, she'd kind of throw herself down on the bank and wave her machete in the air and say, it were better I were dead. And then I also in that paper talk about a powerful example, narrative told by a cattle farmer and his wife about the death of their young child. It's very beautifully and poignantly told. He's just like the very best writer in the kinds of details he selects. And in the end, he contrasts his household where there was this funeral and the household next door where there was to be a wedding. So that when the child finally did die sometime during the night, he said, we have to hurry very quickly and bury the child because we don't want to interfere with the wedding. Meanwhile, the neighbors next door said, we have to stop playing our loud music because we don't want to interfere with the mourning. So it's this kind of beautiful story about cooperation between different human beings. I don't want to get into too many details about this, but the point is, how crazy to think that people who don't speak the standard language don't have the same kinds of sensitivities and emotions and, in a sense, intelligences about the world and people around them as others. So I love Giovanni's question because I think people around the world speak with a certain amount of poetry and certainly expressiveness in their language, and this question allows me to respond to that point. So we had another question from Shaba Shams about, the amount of influence that race and ethnicity have on linguistic behavior. And I think it's quite significant. In fact, a number of us at Stanford, we have Professor Alim, Ball, and myself, a couple of years ago started a Center for Race and Ethnicity and Language at Stanford. And we had a major conference here last year. We're now editing the proceedings of that called Racing Language and Languaging Race, showing the kinds of ways in which language can shape perceptions of and attitudes to different racial groups, and how, of course, race and racial differences and ethnic differences can also influence how language develops. A question from Rebecca Green was about whether racial segregation in the United States is increasing and whether that's somehow leading to, in fact, more differentiation of dialects. It's hard to answer that, especially to answer it in a global way that applies everywhere in the United States. Professor William Labov, a few years ago, talked about the segregation, de facto segregation of black and white vernaculars, and pointed out that in places like Philadelphia, if you looked over the years from about 1850 to 1970, 1980, in fact, the degree to which people had less contact with members of another race had in fact increased steadily over the years. I mean, people tend to think, well, because of desegregation laws and so on, there's more interaction, but also at the same time, when you get white flight from the cities, and you get these inner city areas where more people are congregated, you can often get a certain degree of increasing segregation. So it's hard to give an overall estimate. There are a lot of other places where that isn't true. One of the really striking things for me is how segregated schools are. And only today I was reading something in the New York Times about that. Because I increasingly go into schools where I see schools today that are, 80% or 90% people of color. VHL Jean School used to be all white in 1980 or 70 when it was founded. Now it's 95% black and 5% Latino, of which 1% is black Latino. So it's a very interesting issue. So Per Oscar Stinchcombe asked a question about dialects. He says, why do people say Boston accent and they really only mean white Boston accent? That is an issue, and a number of people have shown that very often when there are developments happening in the white community in cities, linguistic developments, African Americans are not necessarily taking part in those developments. So to get a better understanding of what's happening regionally, we really should look at different ethnic groups and different social classes within various areas. He also says, why do we lump all regional variation in Black English into the single label African American Vernacular English? And that's an issue that's attracted a lot of attention in recent years. So that in particular, people have shown that there's a lot of regional variation, especially in pronunciation. So we are beginning to pay more attention to that. We continue to be struck by the fact that a lot of the grammatical variation is still very strikingly almost ironed out. That is, we find that some of the central grammatical features, what happens with features like deletion of is and are, what happens with been, what happens with done, possessives and so on, are very strikingly similar. One of the reasons for that is because almost all the African Americans in other part of the country came from the Deep South. That is, until about 1900, 90% of the African American population was concentrated in the South, and then they moved east and I mean, they north and west and towards the Midwest, like Chicago and so on and so forth. And very often, even people who are out in California go back to grandmothers and grandfathers and great-grandparents who are still in the South. So they kind of fan out from a common base. Well, there's a last question by Yolanda Cruz that I think is very interesting. She asks, why are some accents more accepted and even copied in a flattering way, mostly European, while African and Latino accents are perceived as a sign of a lack in education? And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that very often attitudes to various accents reflect attitudes toward their speakers. So that for better or worse, people often take whatever attitudes they already have to a particular group and transfer it to their speakers. And we have a set of experiments that have been done in linguistics and social psychology that in fact show this very strikingly, because they'll take the same speaker and they'll ask that speaker to read a passage in the guise of a French speaker or an English speaker or an African American English speaker and a standard English speaker. And then they'll ask listeners to rate them. And usually the listeners don't realize it's exactly the same person. And they'll find one speaker who speaks the standard or more prestigious accent, usually associated with a more prestigious group, as smarter, taller, more good-looking, all kinds of ridiculous things. So I mean, what's very striking is that it is exactly the same person. So the voice quality is controlled for, but you're getting these readings off of the accents. And the readings off of the accents, in turn, go back to attitudes towards the speakers. It's actually, Yolanda, even more pernicious than this, because we have a series of very powerful experiments that show that if you play the same soundtrack and you show the putative speaker as a white kid, a black kid, or a Latino kid, they will be heard as speaking more non-standardly or more badly or more vernacularly, even though it's actually exactly the same soundtrack. So people give us this extra edge. And that in turn is particularly pernicious because when you form a negative attitude to a student on the basis of his or her ethnicity or race and his or her accent, or you read into the accent more than it's there, we have a lot of evidence that you set up a series of teacher expectations, which in turn feed negatively into students' performance. So that's a very powerful question, and I thank you for it. There's lots of other things I could talk about here. If you gave me my full 50-minute classroom slot, or even better, my 3-hour classroom slot, Wednesdays 1 to 4 or something like that, we could talk about this. I'd love to break you into discussion groups and see what issues arise based on what we've talked about so far. But I think for now we'll have to kind of leave it at this and look forward to more research that I can share with you on a future occasion.
Stanford University.